Sergeant, give us your full name.
Georgiana Lynn Kibido Sonnier.
Give us your work address.
7919 Independence Boulevard, 70806.
What agency do you work for?
Louisiana State Police,
How long have you worked for Louisiana State Police?
approximately 12 and a half years.
What division were you assigned on February 16, 2022?
At that time, I was recently promoted to sergeant at crisis response. However, I was tasked with additional responsibilities in internal affairs to conduct an administrative investigation.
Tell me your duties and responsibility as a state police officer, February 16, 2022.
As it relates to crisis response, that's in the Emergency Operations Center, overseeing and assisting with critical incidents related to storms, natural disasters, or man-made. As it related to internal affairs, it was to do investigations related to potential policy violations according to DPS and state police policy and procedures.
How long have you been doing that?
Doing which one, sir?
Policy violations.
I was temporarily assigned to internal affairs prior to my promotion and had done administrative investigations in particular for approximately 9 months.
What is your current position?
Currently, I am the case sergeant in internal affairs. I was reassigned to that position in April. Someone took my, we swapped. Someone came to crisis response and I went back to internal affairs as the case sergeant.
I need to bring your attention to an incident that happened on February 16, 2022. Are you familiar with that incident?
Yes, sir.
Tell us, did you conduct any investigations in that incident?
Yes, sir.
Did you conduct the investigation by yourself?
No, sir.
Who partnered with you to conduct the investigation?
There were several other internal affairs investigators that partnered or assisted in that investigation, which included former Trooper Donnie Petro, Trooper First Class Tony Washington, Master Trooper Kevin Ducote, and Sergeant Sharma, Karan Sharma.
During the course of your investigation, what supporting document did you review?
During the course of the investigation, we received several documents from the training academy. Initially, we had received incident reports that were written by the training academy staff. We also received, during the course of the investigation, a standards operating procedure, cadet manual, some other appendixes, which I can't really recall the names of those at this time, some email exchanges between Lieutenant Colonel Chris Eskew, Major David McClendon, and Captain Slayton.
During the course of your investigation, did you conduct interviews?
Yes, sir.
How many of interviews did you conduct approximately?
I know that we conducted more than 35. I know of that 23 cadet interviews.
What is the effect of these interviews on the operations of the department?
So the purpose of the...
I'm going to object. She's the foundation for her being able to answer that question has not been laid.
I will rephrase. During this investigation, you said you conducted how many investigations?
Interviews or
Interviews.
We conducted more than 35 interviews during the course of the investigation.
Where did you conduct the interviews?
Most of the interviews were conducted at internal affairs at State Police Headquarters. Some of them were conducted over at JESIC, the Joint Emergency Staff Training Center in Zachary, because the cadets were engaged in some type of training at that facility, and in order to accommodate them, we did have to go there.
And what was the effect of those interviews on those cadets?
Objection. Calls for speculation.
How did you conduct those interviews?
We conducted those interviews by providing each of the witnesses and or Lieutenant Graham, because he was the subject in the investigation. We provided them with notification letters advising them that it was an administrative investigation, that they were either the target and or a witness in those investigations. When we conducted those interviews, like I previously stated, we either met them at Internal Affairs or at Majestic. We introduced ourselves, provided them with an initial informative statement of some sort to let them know why we were conducting that interview, and provided them with an opportunity to give us their knowledge or perspective on what they saw in particular on February 16th, because they were present in training that day.
What happened after you finished those recorded interviews?
So once you complete an interview, you will put together a brief synopsis of some of the facts or some of the information you gathered during those interview statements and things of that nature.
As part of your investigation, what other material did you review?
In addition to that, we were actually provided with surveillance video footage from the training academy pool area wherein the particular incident that was alleged took place.
How much of this video did you look at?
So I looked at video from February 16th, 2022 for the entirety of the pool training session with the cadets, between instructors and cadets on that particular day, in addition to a brief video on February 17th. In addition to that, I also saw video that the production manager for the training academy, Colton Vickers, had acquired.
Mr. Chairman, this is the moment that we're going to play the surveillance video. It's going to be a while. It's about 10 to 15 minutes long. And after that, I'll come back and ask you some questions.
Yes, sir.
Is that okay? Right?
Hold for 1 second. Ms. White, what time is the Zoom call?
At 11:30.
11:30, okay, so just keep an eye on that. At 11:30, we're gonna pause this testimony, have the Zoom, and then we can resume,
Oh, okay.
okay?
Before you resume your questions, the people that we saw in the upper left-hand corner of the video, just before it stopped, they went back in the pool, were those the two individuals?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And the one in red was Lieutenant?
It was Lieutenant Russell Graham, yes, sir.
Okay, and the one with the gray shirt was?
Was Mr. Kevin Blake.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Did you show this video to Lieutenant Graham?
Yes, sir.
What was his reaction?
So during his interview, we went through what occurred on that particular day, and then we allowed him to view the video and add any other information that he wanted to at that time. Lieutenant Graham asserted that during his interaction with Kevin Blake in the pool, that he was trying to get Mr. Blake to perform like the other cadets had done, and to get him to complete the physical activity just as the other cadets had also completed. Because Mr. Blake was in the video seen to be closer to the shallow end, and Mr. Blake could touch, Lieutenant Graham's purpose was to get him where he could not touch the bottom of the pool in order to make him swim and not utilize the bottom of the pool for any type of support. That was the purpose of his interaction, is what he told us. And then he told us that during his interaction that Mr. Blake tried to grab on him, and that he was not able to touch the bottom of the pool, and although a good swimmer, he still believed that he could be pushed underwater and things of that nature. Which is why he asserted that he reached up and grabbed Mr. Blake by the neck to force Mr. Blake to release his grasp on him, and this was after Lieutenant Graham stated that he had actually tried to push Mr. Blake away from him.
Were there any other officers present at the pool area?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell me what are their names?
So during physical training, Trooper Jordan Garrett, which he is now Sergeant Garrett, Lieutenant Sammy Robinson, Trooper Joseph Drago, Lieutenant Scott Davis, I would have to see the video to recall each of their names by face.
Okay. Can we, I know, Ms. Dene, could you rewind? I really want to be able to tell us who was in the pool.
Yes, sir.
Back to 6:30.
Who was in the pool with,
Yes, ma'am, if that is it okay if I stand up and to be able to get closer to the video?
Yes.
So in this particular angle up on the seated area is Sergeant Garrett. Further. This would be Lieutenant Scott Davis.
so that you could see?
Trooper Trey Grenier. And that's Lieutenant Graham. That's Lieutenant Scott Davis that you just put the cursor over. That is Lieutenant Russell Brown in the red shirt and Mr. Blake.
How deep is the water where they are right now?
So you can see by the video, they have markers on the sides of the pool, and I believe that one states 5 feet.
How deep does it go?
To 15 feet
Down on
approximately.
the other end or?
Deep end on the left or right?
Show them what a deep end is.
Yes, sir. So to the left of the screen would be the deep end, to the right of the screen would be the shallow end. There is a drop off, a sharp drop off between the shallow end and the deep end.
What's the next marker say on the left-hand side of the line? The one on the right-hand side says 5 feet, correct?
Yes, and the 15 feet.
Oh, so it's a pretty quick drop off.
Yes, sir.
Give us a warning next time.
As a result of your investigation, did you write any reports?
Yes, sir. There were several supplemental reports or narratives related to interviews or documents reviewed, and then a case report that provided the synopsis of the interviews, the initial information, the documents reviewed, the information that we obtained through those means.
During the course of your interview, tell us why you used the word use of force investigation.
Yes, sir. So upon receiving the initial information, like I stated earlier, it was the incident reports that were written by the training academy staff. In Lieutenant Graham's incident report, he states that while conducting physical training with Mr. Blake, that Mr. Blake had grabbed a hold of him, that he couldn't release his grasp, that he could no longer touch the bottom of the pool, that he forcefully had to push Mr. Blake away, but was still unable to release his grasp. Therefore, he grabbed Mr. Blake by the neck and in order to and applied pressure in order to get Mr. Blake to release the grasp. Now, it was based off of that information, it was that Lieutenant Graham believed that he could sustain some type of possible injury and that he was in some type of physical danger. Therefore, it was a use of force incident. He is using force to combat force on himself. That is what state police policy states. And it's the use of force policy, although that was not the targeted policy in the investigation per se, that was a policy we looked at, which addresses a chokehold. And under chokehold, it particularly states the deliberate application of pressure, and it gives you multiple examples of that, being the front of the neck and also the sides of the neck to restrict the airway in some sort of way.
Earlier on, you testified that you interviewed several cadets. Were these cadets able to identify Lieutenant Graham?
There were multiple cadets that were able to identify Lieutenant Graham. There were, I believe, 8 cadets that actually saw some type of physical interaction or push by Lieutenant Graham on Mr. Blake at some point in time during the physical exercises.
Based upon your gathering of information from your interview, what was your conclusion?
Based off of the interviews and the video surveillance, what we determined was that although Lieutenant Graham may have perceived at that moment or stated that there was some threat and that is why he used the application of the pressure to the throat, ultimately, if you watch the surveillance video, Lieutenant Graham placed himself in the position on multiple times to be in very close proximity to Cadet Blake. Therefore, that is officer-induced jeopardy, which is more typically used in criminal investigations which is where a great amount of my experience comes from. However, it's still applicable in this case, wherein he placed himself in jeopardy, and therefore he had to use the application of force because he felt like he was being threatened in order to stop the force being used against him.
I don't want to interrupt, Mr. Chairman. I remember watching it's 11:30, but do you want me to continue?
Ms. White,
Yes.
should we stop now?
Sergeant Borshading is in the waiting room,
Okay,
muted waiting room, so I can message him. Or
well, I mean, this was the amount of time you had based on his schedule in California, is that correct? So you want to start now? Is that,
How much longer do you have, do you think?
I think about like 10 to 15 minutes.
10 to 15 minutes?
Okay. If you don't mind, I'd like to go ahead and, get Sergeant Borcherding, because we do have limited time with him.
I'm able to, be on. It's fine with
Okay,
me.
okay, so what we'll do is we'll ask you to step back outside.
Yes,
and
ma'am.
You're just on pause for now.
Yes,
We're gonna
ma'am.
have another witness and then we'll bring you back in.
Last question I was asking you, before we took the break, you were talking about if there were cadets who were able to identify Lieutenant Graham, and what was your response?
Yes, some of the cadets were able to identify Lieutenant Graham.
And what did you learn from those cadets?
So although the cadets did not see the entirety of the incident, they did see bits and pieces of it. And I believe it was 8 cadets that actually said that they saw a physical interaction between Lieutenant Graham and Mr. Blake, and saw Lieutenant Graham push Mr. Blake at some point in time.
Did you find any violation of the state police policy?
Yes, so in reviewing the policies and taking in consideration the documents we had reviewed and the interviews that we had conducted along with the surveillance video footage, it was determined that conduct unbecoming of an officer would be most fitting because it encompassed all parts pretty much of what had occurred during this particular incident.
My final question, did you, during your investigation, you testified that you also interviewed Lieutenant Graham, correct?
Yes, sir.
And what, if any, did he tell you?
So, as I had previously stated earlier, when I spoke with Lieutenant Graham, he asserted the reasoning for his interaction with Mr. Blake was to get him to perform the PT as the other cadets had done so. And that during this specific throat grab, there were many pushes and pulls in the entire video or during the entire incident. But in particular, the throat grab, he asserted that he was doing that because he was, he had no more footing on the pool and things like that. So that was some of the information that we gained during his interview with us. In addition to that, Lieutenant Graham admitted that the optics of that video did not look good. And so we understand and you take into consideration an event that is occurring, and although use of force incidents are typically dealing with the public or dealing with civilians, this was a training environment. And based off of his testimony, or his interview, I apologize, and again, the video surveillance, it was determined that what we initially thought could possibly be some type of use of force policy violation, or some other type of violation, it was not. In fact, he was the aggressor, not Mr. Blake, because he placed himself in that position to have to use some type of force against Mr. Blake based off of their, the pushing and pulling that had occurred.
I think that would be, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Sergeant Thibodeau, Sonnier, my name is Marion White. I represent Lieutenant Russell Graham. I have some questions for you today.
Yes, ma'am.
So I understand your testimony this morning is that you had been conducting investigations for internal affairs for 9 months prior to February 16, 2022, is that correct?
That was the administrative investigation portion. However, of my 20 years of law enforcement, I've conducted investigations of various sorts, including administrative, criminal, and background investigations for approximately 15 years.
Okay. And can you tell me how many investigations you had conducted before February 16th, 2022?
In totality, I'm not certain, ma'am.
Okay. Can you give a range? Was it more than 10? Or 20?
Absolutely. And you're speaking about administrative investigations or criminal investigations? Background?
All
Oh,
investigations.
I absolutely could not tell you a specific number. I was approximately 22, 23 years old, and I'm now 40. So off and on, I've conducted investigations.
Okay. Could you tell me how many administrative investigations you had conducted before February 16th, 2022?
I couldn't even tell you that. I'm not really certain.
All right. Have you had as many, in all of your investigations you've conducted, have you had as many witnesses as you have for this one?
I have done some major investigations, including with state police. I do not know that they would have reached 35 interviews, but I would gauge that it would be, I could have done that fairly closely when you're talking about use of force incidents, officer-involved shootings, homicide investigations that cross multi-jurisdictions involving a kidnapping. Yes, there's a multitude of interviews that are conducted, but I could not tell you if it equated to approximately 35.
Okay. And speaking of use of force, you testified earlier that originally this investigation was a use of force investigation, correct?
No, the way that it's done is it is an administrative investigation regarding potential violations of DPS and or LSP policies. It was related to a use of force incident, which that initial information was gathered based off of Lieutenant Graham's incident report along with other incident reports. But the specific policy of use of force, we look at all policies. It was the use of force incident.
Okay. The use of force policy for state police, that's a criminal policy?
It is a policy, which is a guide to what we live by. That is usually more restrictive than the law. It is absolutely a policy we do look at in administrative investigations. And for the purposes of this, it was considered. However, a criminal investigation can occur due to a use of force incident also.
Okay.
It just did not happen in this instance, and we do not do criminal investigations in internal affairs.
Okay, so my question is, LSP's use of force policy, is that not a criminal policy?
That is an administrative policy that is based off of best practices across the country, what the law says that law enforcement officers are allowed to do.
Okay. At what point in time during the investigation was the decision made that the violation would not be use of force, that it would be, or that you would not be investigating a use of force incident, you would be investigating a policy violation of conduct unbecoming an officer?
I do not recall that there was a specific date wherein we were not going to, that we always considered all policies that could possibly fit. And again, this was what we thought to be a use of force incident, not restricting ourselves to the use of force policy. We have to look at all things based off of the circumstances that arise during the investigation. Again, I don't recall a specific date. I can only tell you that typically on a weekly basis we meet and we discuss our cases with each other and with legal, but I can't recall an exact date for you that it was absolutely determined which policy we were absolutely going to go with. We look at all of them. It's not like we stay the course on one and then immediately change it. It's an ever-evolving situation based off of the facts and information gathered.
when you began your interviews with all of these 35-plus witnesses, isn't it true that you started the interview by informing the witness that this was a use of force or potential use of force incident?
Well, I introduce, during an interview, we introduce ourselves, we get them to speak about who they are, where they work at, what section, etc. And then we have to give them an idea of what we're there to speak about, absolutely. And yes, I would state in several interviews, but I was not conducting them by myself, there were other people conducting them also, that it was related to a potential use of force incident. That is correct.
Okay. And you did not state that it was in reference to a potential conduct unbecoming an officer incident in any of the interviews. Is that accurate?
Correct. This conduct unbecoming of an officer is a policy. Use of force is also a policy, but this was a use of force incident, which there is a specific policy. But again, we evaluate all policies. That's why the notification letter says a administrative investigation regarding potential violations of DPS and or LSP policies, and then we give a brief description based off of the initial information that we received. And we are bound by giving notification with a certain amount of time to, of course, the subject of the investigation, and then, of course, when we identify witnesses, we attempt to do that very early on. So based off the initial information is why we do that. And then when we're conducting our interviews, it's not until you have all evidence and all facts gathered and all information that you can put together a puzzle and say, as a totality, this is the policy that would be best suited for this particular violation.
So after interviewing more than 35 witnesses, reviewing documents, you were finally able to determine which policy Lieutenant Graham violated. Is that correct?
Yes. So again, use of force policy was looked at. Conduct unbecoming was looked at. Unsatisfactory performance was looked at. Conformance to laws was looked at. All of those policies were just some of the policies that were looked at based off of everything that occurred, based off of meeting, and you use your peers to, because everybody has different investigative training and also have different knowledge. And again, I didn't conduct every single interview. There were interviews that I conducted myself with a teammate in the office, and then there were interviews that were conducted by 2 other investigators and not strictly by myself.
Okay. Did you draft, let me ask you this, we talked about in your testimony a report that you made, is that correct? You drafted a report?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, all right. And I want to have you identify that report.
Okay.
So, if I may approach the witness?
Sure.
I apologize, I don't have copies of all of them. Is this the report that you drafted?
Based off of my initial observations, yes, ma'am.
You talked about earlier in your testimony this morning that there were supplemental reports. Can you tell me about the supplemental reports you were
So,
talking about?
what occurs is when, in this case, there were, again, approximately 35 interviews that were done. Because these interviews were not done just strictly by myself, the other investigators would then provide a synopsis of information that they had gathered when they did their interview. It is best practices for the individual conducting the interview provide not just notes, but something of substance, although it is not a transcript of the interview. And those are called supplements. So those assist with providing a accurate or the most accurate depiction of what those interviews, what information those interviews gave us. And so then that was, the information that was gained during those interviews was then synopsized and placed into the report. The case is a totality of this report, which is synopsis of portions, along with interviews, supporting documentations. That is an entire case. So it's not just based off of this one report.
Okay. Now, you testified when you looked at this report that this was based off your initial observations. Is that correct?
Correct.
But at the end of the report on the last page, do you see where there's a finding of conduct unbecoming an officer sustained?
Yes, ma'am.
So, I guess my question is, was there some observations that you or someone else had after you prepared this report?
Can you rephrase the question? I'm not certain what you're asking me.
Okay. Well, what I'm trying to ask is, you said this report was prepared based on your initial observation. So, was there something else that occurred after you prepared this report where you concluded that that there was a policy violation? Was there something else after your initial observations that we don't have in front of us right now?
No, ma'am. So I believe that there's a misunderstanding about the way that maybe administrative investigations go. The initial information received was based off of the emails that were exchanged between Lieutenant Colonel Eskew and Major McClendon, and then based off of we immediately received very early on in the investigation the incident reports that were written by Lieutenant Graham and other training academy staff. They were required to write an incident report, not at the direction of internal affairs, however at the direction of, I believe it was Captain Slayton. That was the initial information. Based off of the initial information, off of those reports, and the email exchange between Lieutenant Colonel Eskew is why we started with a potential use of force incident and looking at that policy and conformance to laws and conduct. And we looked at all of those. In the end, the best suited policy was conduct unbecoming, because this was a different situation based off, it was not while Lieutenant Graham was out in the public arena, however, at work, interacting with a civilian, because they're not commissioned personnel, but they are employees of the agency. We also looked at violence in the workplace. At the end, conduct unbecoming was the best suited policy related to the violations that Lieutenant Graham had committed.
Okay, so does this report that you have sitting in front of you detail all of the interviews you conducted, all of the documents you reviewed to come to that conclusion?
Again, the report is a synopsis of the investigation. The entirety of the case investigation includes the audio recordings, video recordings of interviews, the documents that we did review. So this is a synopsis, an overview of the findings and the information gathered throughout the entire investigation. So it is not detailed.
Okay. Where does this report go? I see you sent it to Lieutenant Armand Douglas. Where does it go after that, do you know?
So the review process that I can recall right now that would have occurred at that time, because the process is a little bit different now, was that you send it to a peer to review it. Somebody, it could be of equal rank, or if, like if I was a trooper at the time and another trooper wasn't available, then I may ask one of the sergeants to review it. And that would not necessarily be the first line supervisor sergeant. It could be the background sergeant. So it would have went to a peer review. So my peer and equivalent at that time would have been Sergeant Richard Buckland. He reviewed it. And then once he reviews it, sees grammatical errors or things that may need to be clarified, he'll send it back. And then it goes to Lieutenant Douglas, and he does the same process. And that could occur one time, two times. They're looking at making sure that there's questions, that questions are answered, I apologize, and that things are in chronological order, there's not any major grammatical errors. And then it comes back to the investigator to make those corrections or answer those questions. And then it's either submitted to the captain for review, or it could go for a second review with the lieutenant. It just depends on the investigation, and every investigation is different.
Okay. When it's finalized, does it go to some review board or to superintendent for his review?
Correct. So once the report is completed, and there is a disciplinary review committee that is held, or with the disciplinary review board, copies of the overview of the investigation, which would be this report in front of me, would go to the command staff or those members on the board, our legal section, the person's supervisor, things of that nature. And every person could be different, because obviously your supervisor comes in or the captain of that section comes in. So it's not like a standard list of people it goes to, with the exception of the colonel would receive it, the chief of staff, and legal.
Okay. Did you make the decision that there was a policy violation in this case?
I suggested the policy violation of conduct unbecoming. At any point in time, the disciplinary review committee can state, even during the DRC, that they feel that another policy is most appropriate. So we suggest them. That does not mean that that is an absolute.
Okay. But you did sustain it, and when it says sustain on the last page, that's your
The
recommendation.
suggestion and recommendation based off of all of the internal affairs investigators and supervisors was that there should be a sustainment for conduct unbecoming, and that was our suggestion.
Okay. All right. And you said that you felt like that one was most fitting in this case. Can you state why you thought that was most fitting?
So, conduct unbecoming was most fitting because Lieutenant Graham is definitely someone who has been around for many years in state police and especially in the training academy. He is well respected. There's no doubt that he's a great instructor. I absolutely wholeheartedly believe that. However, when it came to this particular instance and his interaction with the cadet, with Mr. Blake in particular, those actions were not a true representation of what state police stands for. It was not, it does bring discredit upon our agency and our training practices. It does put us in a light wherein the public may see it, and that causes more problems for the agency as a whole. The practices that Lieutenant Graham said were common practices were not like a concurrent belief amongst all of his peers. And it was absolutely, it did not show favorably upon him nor the agency as a whole. We have a high standard. At that time, our academy was more paramilitary, and we were a paramilitary organization, but it was definitely a paramilitary environment. But I don't know when it has ever been appropriate to put your hands in that manner on a cadet unless you are training in a particular scenario, in defensive tactics, and it is in a dangerous, and the aggravating circumstance in this was the fact that it was in a body of water. And that is not appropriate, and it does not reflect favorably upon us as an agency as a whole, nor on him.
Sergeant, Thibodeau Sonnier, you've never been an instructor at the training academy, have you,
I am an instructor for the training academy, yes ma'am.
currently? How long have you been one?
I am currently a taser instructor. I'm currently a leads instructor. And I have assisted in cadet training, in cadet class training, in-service training for 5-6 years maybe. I'm not really certain.
Okay. So you were 5 to 6 years, which part? Because you gave me several.
Taser instructor has probably been my longest runner, which would be somewhere 5 to 6 years. The de-escalation leads instructor, I have been an instructor, I'm not really certain, less than 2 years probably. And I cannot really recall what other, if any, instructor certifications I currently possess, just slip of the mind, but I do know those too.
Okay. So as you spoke earlier, you testified earlier that, essentially that the opinions formed by the interviewees during the investigation were different with respect to their view on what happened in the interaction. Is that correct?
So their perception of the incident was definitely different. Some saw bits and pieces of it, some saw none of it. The majority of the cadets, so 20, I think I said 23 or 24 cadets that were present that day were interviewed, and majority actually believed that what was occurring was a smoking session, so corrective physical activity. That was what they believed was occurring. However, and that's what the information they provided to me. But they did not see the entirety of the incident.
But you had opinions of high-level ranking officers that felt like that the interaction was in fact appropriate, correct?
So based off of what those instructors saw during their time in the pool, out of the pool, etc., was what their opinion was based on. However, unless you can show, and we were not able to show, nor prove that they watched the entire incident from beginning to end, you may look at one piece of it and that may seem appropriate because the intention Lieutenant Graham gave was that he was trying to get the cadet to perform the physical activity. So that may be a piece that they see where Lieutenant Graham is maybe pushing Cadet Blake back towards the deep end and then they may turn away. But if you do not see all of it, your opinion is merely based on what you saw in a moment.
It might be helpful if you have an explanation, you answer the question first, and then give us your explanation.
Okay.
Did you draft this report?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you, in drafting the report, did you refer back to the audio recordings of the interviews of the witnesses when you drafted their synopsis?
I'm pretty certain that I would have. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I want to direct you to page 18 of this report. And it's not numbered, so, I apologize, I did mean to mark it, and is yours marked, Sergeant Thibodeau?
No, ma'am.
Okay.
I believe it's 25 pages. So it starts with Lieutenant Graham explained it did not matter. Would that be page 18?
I'm getting there. Yes,
Yes, ma'am.
that's correct. Okay. All right, I'm sorry, let me go to my copy real quick. I'm trying to find where we are. It states Lieutenant Graham and Blake walked to the deep end. I'm gonna try to find that real quick. I apologize. Okay, it's in the middle paragraph, the second paragraph, right in the middle of that paragraph. It starts with, again, when they exited the water. Do you see that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Again, when they exited the water, Cadet Blake said he would not quit. Lieutenant Graham told him they would continue training, walked to the deep end, and he pushed Cadet Blake into the water as to make sure he would not hit the side of the pool on his way in.
Yes, ma'am. I see that.
Okay. Now, do you recall, or isn't it true that Lieutenant Graham never admitted in his interview that he pushed Cadet Blake into the pool?
That's incorrect.
Okay. Did you mark in the audio interview of the portion of that interview where Lieutenant Graham said that?
Somewhere around a little over 1 hour into his interview, Lieutenant Graham admits that he had pushed Blake into the pool, as he had done so with other cadets when either they hesitated to go into the pool or seemed tired, and then he would do that. Yes, ma'am, he did.
Okay. Well, I have the portion of the audio interview from that day, and I'd like to provide that right now. Switch up, sorry.
So is this at the spot where she gets identified?
Yes.
Attorney White, yeah, I believe it's somewhere around 104, maybe 108, somewhere along those lines, correct?
Would you please let us know the point at which you are starting playing?
Yes, sir. I want to wait. Oh, are we ready? Okay.
Well, I think she said it was either 104 or 108.
We start at 104.
104. Just a moment, sorry.
I will put their conference on.
This is 104.
And that's not just at peak.
Does that sound okay?
PT, you know, one of the things, PT, they do that a lot, they arch when they're doing push-ups. And I will put a thumb in the middle of their back and push that. Not hard enough to cause, you know, spinal injuries, but hold enough to make it, it's very uncomfortable. And it makes it hard for you to do a push-up when you're already tired. So,
Right.
you know, those kind of things, it's a regular thing. Firearms,
Is that near the area you were talking about?
Yes, sir. It's
Okay.
it's coming
Let's
Keep
there.
going.
We're dropping your magazine out, we're shaking you, we're slapping you on your back, we're popping you in the back of the head. Again, everything to make you uncomfortable, nothing to hurt you. Mobile field force, that's probably, I would say that's probably the most visible between mobile field force and BTT, where you see mobile field force, I mean, if somebody starts what they do, they try to submarine, right? They're worried about the gas, so they're trying to slide behind another cadet, and so they can start putting a mask on early or something. And hundreds of times, me included, have grabbed a cadet and yanked them out of there, or all through the line, you know, go running through a line that they left a hole in when they try to come in while you're rolling them over.
Right.
So yeah, there's a whole lot of, I hate that word, physicality, it's not a real word, but physical interaction with cadets.
So when it comes to physical training in itself, describe situations like that when it comes to physical training, besides why we're here.
Right.
Whether in the pool, well, you know, especially if you've seen it or it's had to be done even on ground, not
Right.
just in the pool.
So that pool example, just this class alone, I've pushed several cadets off the edge. And I kind of mentioned it earlier, and I don't know, I went off on a tangent, but if this is the edge of the pool, and the cadet who's worried or tired a little bit, they start just stepping off, and instead of stepping off into the water, they'll step and turn and just kind of fall into the water. Well, you're looking at about a 4-foot drop before their elbow can hit the edge of that concrete and crack. So there have been several times, and Cadet Jones in this academy is probably the one that I was the roughest, and y'all investigating me for this, you might as well look at Cadet Jones, because he was freaking out about everything, right? So Cadet Jones would stand on the edge of the pool, and he would freak out if his head went in the water, even in the shower. He'd have his feet on the ground, he'd put his head in the water, he'd freak out. So what he was trying to do was step in, turn, and catch the side as he was falling, so he could keep his head in the water. It's extremely dangerous for his face, for his elbow. That's what I always think about, is a cracked elbow.
Yeah.
I saw that happen once in my life, and it's freaked me out.
And you talk about a broken finger even.
Yeah, but you imagine it from 4 feet up, a 180, 200 pound person comes down and cracks an elbow on that concrete edge. It's going to shatter, and then they're done. So Jones is probably my best example. There were several times where he would try to turn and fall in, and I would push him off to make sure that he wasn't anywhere near that edge. Now, for the most part, we have those conversations before that happens, and if I see somebody do it once, I go over there, get in their face, and tell them, hey, you got to step off, you can't do that. So for me in the pool, that's a very common occurrence.
Okay.
I'm chunking people off, getting away from that edge on a regular basis.
Okay.
And partly it freaks me out when I see them doing that, because I'm just waiting for them to hit their face.
Now, have you ever done that where you push them into the pool because there's a hesitation? It's kind of like, I'm scared of heights, and so if I ever go do anything where heights are involved, sometimes I'll tell whatever the person that's with me, participating with me, or the person like strapping you up and
Just push me.
Just push me because
So-
I don't know if I can do it.
So no, I wouldn't do that if they're just not moving. I'll use Blake as my example. I can't tell you how many times I'm in his ear saying, get in the water, get in the water, get in the water. And typically, for whatever reason, for him it was 4 times. You had to say something 4 times then for him to take action. Now, if there was the hesitation where he starts to, and he's at the edge and he's starting to go, but he ain't going too far, I'm going to help him. I'm going to get him away from that edge. But just because you're not getting in, I'm chunking you in.
Okay.
I might do that to like Sammy Robinson as a joke, but I wouldn't do that to a cadet.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so I just played 104 through
It's 108.50.
108.50.
Is that the area where you said that was
Yes,
said?
sir.
Okay. Let's take a short break. I want the lawyers to meet again.
Sergeant Thibodeau Sonnier, after listening to the audio recording of Russell Brand's interview from the Internal Affairs investigation, would you agree with me that Lieutenant Graham did not state to you that he pushed Cadet Blake into the pool on February 16, 2022?
He did not make that exact statement. Yes, I would concur with you.
Okay, thank you. Now, during, Lieutenant Graham's interview, do you recall you actually telling a story of your training academy experience where one of the instructors pulled you out of the line and sent you to the gym for additional exercises?
Yeah, so in that particular incident, I believe I described one instance wherein an instructor took the near collar of my shirt because I was falling behind, and they didn't yank me, but yes, they did pull me out of formation. That would be correct.
Okay, and so this was an instance of physical contact during the training academy, correct?
It was it was some type of physical contact, but not in this. It can't equate to this.
Okay, so my question was, this is an example where you experienced physical contact with an instructor during training academy, correct?
Yes, ma'am, and in order to accurately answer your question, I would have to say that it was not equivalent to this.
Okay, I don't have anything further.
I have just one question. What is smoking session mean?
Smoking session is corrective physical activity.
Thank you.
Yeah, because I was thinking smoking something. All right, thank you.
Commissioners, any questions?
Commissioners? You do? Commissioner Montalbano.
Imagine it's not typical to have an internal investigation within the training academy. So if I could pretty good handle an investigation at True or within BOI, but if I was to do something in the training academy, I wouldn't be very familiar with it. If you had any investigations within the training academy before.
This is the second training academy investigation related to some type of physical force, and I am very well aware of the first one.
What, how do you begin to investigate something in the training academy like this nature? And what did you do for this particular incident as far as starting your investigation?
So in any investigation, whether it's criminal or administrative, you would gather any supporting documents or evidence, and you would identify potential witnesses to an incident. You would then make a plan of action in the sense of determining who needs to be interviewed first and the logistical side of where interviews will be conducted and things like that. So it is similar to criminal investigations, however, it's related to administrative policies. So I look at administrative policies like criminal statutes, essentially. That's what, that's the way I identify. So I would have done the same thing like I just described about obtaining those documents, looking at that information, and then as the investigation goes along, it evolves, and you consider the totality of the circumstances when making, in this case, a suggestion or a recommendation on the policy and or the findings of that policy.
So the first thing you would do is ascertain all the documentation or policies that would
You would attempt to.
And how would you do that?
By making.
Or how would you do it specifically for this?
For this particular investigation, as it relates to this, we had already received the email exchange, again, between Lieutenant Colonel Eskew and Major McClendon, and then very early on, we received the incident reports that were written by Lieutenant Graham. I believe that what came after that was the reviews of Mr. Blake's performance throughout the academy, or up until that point at least, and you look at those things and any other supporting documentation. In this case, it would have been letters of counseling that Mr. Blake had received from Training Academy staff. We then requested the standard operating procedure and or any other living documents. And now that took some time to obtain in this investigation. So we are always, obviously, we're restricted to a timeline and a due date, and so we gather what we can as we go along, so it's not always on the front end.
But your request was immediate, is for the SOPs and things like that?
I can't remember the exact date, to be quite honest. I just don't remember. I just do recall that it didn't come immediately. And then now Lieutenant Colonel Larvadane had to make a secondary request for those documents.
So because there's a secondary request, the first initial was probably early on, I would say right away, probably same day as the investigation started.
I would not say that. The most important thing when an administrative investigation begins is notifying the subject of that investigation, but also identifying witnesses and providing them notification also, and then gathering initial information to see what else besides what you were told was coming in might be there for you to consider on which direction to go.
And you would say those things were done immediately?
Yes, sir.
Who investigates use of force incidents?
When it's a use of force, like a trooper out in the field?
Any use of force incident?
Well, I believe that our policy or the practice is depending on what type of use of force incident, but we now have a force investigation unit.
Do you know when that started?
I couldn't tell you or lock down a date, sir.
Was this a use of force investigation?
This was a use of force incident based off of or it was believed to be a use of force incident based off of what Lieutenant Graham stated. But when it comes to criminal, if there were going to be criminal charges, that would have been done, or potential criminal charges, that would likely have been done by CID and or FIU.
You mentioned earlier officer-induced jeopardy. Can you explain that?
Officer-induced jeopardy, it's more commonly known when it comes to criminal investigations. The Supreme Court has ruled that an officer, for example, this is hypothetical, pursuit occurs between officer and subject, subject stops, officer gets out, commands person to get out of the vehicle, he starts approaching the vehicle, officer then passes the driver and or front passenger door, and he is in front of the vehicle, and the person then presses on the gas, officer fires and asserts that based off of that person's actions he was in fear that there was going to be some type of physical injury and or death, that he fired upon that vehicle. And the Supreme Court has ruled that an officer cannot place themselves in harm's way and then claim self-defense.
Is that what you would equate this incident to?
I wouldn't say it equates to that. It was extremely similar, where they had interacted several times, where there was a pushing and pulling, where Lieutenant Graham placed himself in close proximity to Mr. Blake, and because of his actions, he says that Mr. Blake grabbed onto him and he tried to push Mr. Blake away forcefully. He was unable to do so. Therefore, he grabbed Mr. Blake by the throat and applied pressure.
Was it unreasonable for him to be in such close proximity in the pool?
I believe that if someone is in danger, yes, life-saving measures. I believe by what's shown in the video, There were only a couple of other instructors that had placed themselves at one moment or another in close proximity. If you review the surveillance video, I believe that there were more than, or approximately 30 pushes and pulls by Lieutenant Graham. So that meant that it was more than one time that he would have done so, and I understand what he stated his purpose was. But an aggravating circumstance is that they're in a body of water.
Would you consider the cadet to be cheating, maybe by not, performing the same physical exercise as the rest of the class?
So that's absolutely a consideration. Being through the academy myself, you want everyone to work for it. It is hard. It's not for everybody. You don't want a sandbagger, which somebody who doesn't perform equally. However, in reviewing the surveillance video and speaking with Trooper Garrett, or now Sergeant Garrett, who was in charge of physical training that day, and who described what their physical training was that day, the video shows that Cadet Blake was actually required to perform more than the other cadets. Wherein the other cadets started in their BDUs, or those tops and bottoms, and then they were allowed to take them off. Mr. Blake was not allowed to do so, and he actually performed more laps, or swimming laps back and forth than the other cadets that day.
You referred to Lieutenant Graham as the aggressor today. Is that what you believe? He was the aggressor in this incident?
It absolutely evolved into that, wherein he became the aggressor because he continuously placed himself, and he was continuously the one to push and pull on Mr. Blake when there were, when the corrective activity exercises do not include the pool. So, and him as an academy instructor for many, many years, that is not a corrective activity. Like I said, most of the cadets opined that it was a smoking session, corrective physical activity. But this is not an activity that is on the approved list.
Is that reflected in your investigation or your investigative report?
Yes, sir, it is.
Terminology, aggressor, and
I don't know if I used that word.
what about officer-induced jeopardy?
I don't know either. I would have to review the report.
And then in the report, would you also say that upon starting the investigation, would that be in the report when you started and what you did as to start this investigation?
So, on the first page, it would tell you when we received notification or learned of it. It would tell you when we started the investigation. And then it tells you during the course of the investigation who we interviewed in chronological order. And then it gives you like an investigative finding, so an overview of things that we learned throughout the investigation. Is it a timeline that says like on this date that we performed this action? No, sir, it does not.
I don't have that in front of me. Can you tell me those dates?
Which, sir?
The date that you just suggested.
So, on March 2nd is when the investigation began.
And how did that begin?
So it went through wherein Major McClendon and Lieutenant Colonel Eskew spoke with one another, or emailed back and forth, and they both suggested or recommended that an administrative investigation be done.
That's fine. I think that answers that. You
Okay.
are stating that March 2nd, 2022 was when the
Yes, sir.
administrative investigation began.
Correct, yes, sir. That is when we became aware of it.
That's when you became aware of it and started the investigation.
That is when we, when I say we, I apologize, internal affairs. Now, whether or not,
When did the IA investigation begin?
March 2nd, yes, sir.
Thank you. That's all.
Anybody else? Now, if it hadn't been for the grabbing around the neck, if all the other things had occurred, would you
Yes, sir.
still have found conduct unbecoming?
Yes, sir.
When Lieutenant Graham grabbed him around the neck, do you know where in the pool they were?
If I recall correctly, they were somewhere near the drop-off. I'm not really certain. Somewhere near the shallow end, somewhere near the drop-off in the pool, but I couldn't tell you exactly where.
Do you know which side of the drop-off they were on? Were they on the side where they could stand up, or were they on the side where?
So I
It was
believe
deeper
that
than-
Lieutenant Graham's kind of side back was facing the shallow end, and Cadet Blake would have been, they would have been facing chest to chest per se. You can see in the video wherein there is some like bobbing up and down, I guess you could say, like
Blake or Graham?
by both of them, I believe. They move around a lot in the pool, and there's a good amount where you can see, like, Lieutenant Graham or Lieutenant Graham's neck and above is above the water, and then you can see as if it is like somebody pushing off the bottom of the pool, like bumping, like kind of pushing their foot like off the bottom of the pool. That is happening in the video, like the bobbing. So that would indicate to me that they can touch the bottom of the pool
Without going under?
without going under. That's correct.
You know,
Go ahead.
couldn't the bobbing be caused from treading water?
The only way that, all I can tell you is based off of the way that I know how to tread water. I could not do it while pushing and or pulling on somebody.
And could you tell whether or not Mr. Blake had grabbed Lieutenant?
You couldn't definitively see.
He could have, might not have.
He could have, might not have. Mr. Blake even said, I don't remember doing it. I don't want to say I didn't do it because he didn't want to be untruthful. Lieutenant Graham says that he did grab him somewhere in the chest area or on the shirt or something of that nature, is what he stated. He said that he went underwater, and that was part of the feeling is, though he had to create some distance from Mr. Blake, which also led him to grabbing Mr. Blake to release his grasp off of him.
So the only definitive evidence you had was that Blake had grabbed him?
No, I did not have definitive evidence that Mr. Blake had grabbed Lieutenant
Well,
Graham.
the only direct evidence you had was the testimony of Lieutenant Graham that he had been grabbed, and you had the testimony of Cadet Blake that he didn't know one way or the other, right?
Mr. Blake said he did not believe he had done so,
Okay, but he wasn't sure.
but he was not sure. There would,
All right, that's all I have.
Any other questions? Would this be needed further?
Yes.
Sorry?
Yes.
Yes? Okay.
You're calling, this is your case. You're gonna call her later,
Cool.
before you rest? I'm sorry.
What are you saying?
I'm just asking, you're gonna call her later?
No. Well, I mean, maybe for rebuttal, but that's it.
Okay,
yes,
That's
sir.
what, that was my point.
Okay.
So we're gonna keep the witness here. You're not released.
Yes, ma'am, I understand.
Okay.
Okay.
It may be that they can make arrangements where you can be at your office or something and call you back if necessary, but,
As long as we know that it's not going to delay things.
yeah, as long as there's
I
no delay.
understand.
and I just wanted, I wanted to make sure I introduce, the report as
Okay.
the Collins Exhibit 1, and then the portion of the audio interview that we listened to as Appellant's Exhibit 2. And I guess I need to discuss with y'all how we will actually physically introduce that,
Okay.
maybe on the next break.
Okay. So the audio is two, and one is the report. Do you have a copy of the report?
I mean, you do now have the testimony that she said, it was not said in the audio, so, I mean, it's your call, it's your case, you can handle it how you want to, but you have the testimony at this point.
Right.
Copy.
That's what I'm asking. Is there a copy to give to us?
This one?
Yes, if you don't mind doing that.
And I'll mark exhibit 1 on it.
Okay, thank you.
That's it. Thank you.